Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to KEI. My name is. This will be our final program as part of our academic paper series for this year, which means that we're looking forward to accepting new proposals for next year. If you're interested in writing on anything related to Korea, anything policy related to Korea, please feel free to check out our website. We have a call for papers up right now. We're accepting papers through December 14th. We've received a lot of really great proposals so far, and we're really looking forward to receiving any more. If you have any more questions about the call for papers, please feel free to talk to me afterwards. So for most of us here in DC, most of us in this room, we've sort of been wrapped up. I think I can speak for most of us. We've been wrapped up in diplomacy with North Korea over the past year or so, and trying to figure out North Korea policy objectives through looking at North Korea messaging internally and externally to try and figure out where things are going. But our speaker with us here today reminds us the importance of not only looking at things internally, but taking a little bit further step back and seeing how things have progressed, not only within the past year, but look at things have progressed from Kim Jong-il up through Kim Jong-un, and looking at not just media op-eds like so much of us has been focusing on, but looking at literature and North Korean literature and how that really, the evolution of North Korean literature from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un can really teach us a lot about what Kim Jong-un's policy objectives and policy priorities are. And we have with us today a really great up-and-coming emerging scholar in the field of Korea policy. You have her Korea studies. You have her bio here. It's on the program flyer. But just to iterate some of the key points, she's a managing editor of the Social Science Japan Journal and associate professor at the University of Tokyo. She just recently finished up her PhD at the University of Southern California. And a couple of additional things that aren't here on her bio. She is she's a member of the newest cohort of the CSIS Next Gen Korea Scholars. She received a Korea grant, a Fulbright Korea grant to study in Korea, and she also spent time at the Korea Institute for National Unification. So she is very well studied and well read on these topics, and really looking forward to, I read her paper, and I'm really looking forward to how she shares it with us all here today. So I'll turn things over to Meredith to get us started.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to Kyle for giving me this opportunity to travel all the way from Tokyo to visit our nation's capital. It's always a pleasure. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a research project that I've been working on for a little over 2 years, in which I've been reading North Korean, I call it state-produced fiction. How I got started in this project basically is that I was working at the Korea Institute for National Unification, and some of the fellows there introduced me to this kind of fiction that is produced by the North Korean regime, by the Korean Workers' Party. It's really interesting to me as a political scientist how these stories, they're not what you normally think of as creative writing, where the author is kind of off on their own, getting inspired, writing, and then trying to get published. It's a very top-down model of producing fiction to serve the state. This model, you can say that it originated in the early Soviet Union, but was transplanted to North Korea and continues there today. So I argue that North Korean fiction is not very useful to be analyzed from a literary, comparative literature perspective. It doesn't have the same elements of interaction with the audience that normal literature does, but it is very useful from a political science perspective, and so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So this is just what the story looks like when I get it. It appears there are two major literary magazines. There are several others, but there are two big ones, Chosun Munak and Cheongneon Munak. And this is an article from Chosun Munak that talks about weather prediction in North Korea and the efforts to improve their weather prediction capacity. So I read the story, I translate parts of it, and I analyze the rest on my humble Blogspot blog, which I encourage you to check out if you want more details on this. And there are a lot of themes that have come from the fiction of recent years that I analyze in much more detail. The theme that I'm going to talk about today is the North Korean slogan, "The Strong and Prosperous Nation," and how that has appeared in fiction recently. Just a few words at the beginning. Fiction writing in North Korea falls under the purview of the Korean Writers Union, which is a subdivision of the Propaganda and Agitation Department. As you may know, this is a very powerful wing of the North Korean Workers' Party. In the past, it was Kim Jong-il's kind of springboard to power when he was a young man. That was his first entry into the political stage. And currently its deputy director is Kim Yo-jong, who is Kim Jong-un's sister. So you can sense that this agency, the Propaganda and Agitation Department, is very central to how the party builds its policy, and the Korean Writers Union, as a subdivision of that, is charged with disseminating messages that the party wants to send to the people. You can really describe this as internal propaganda, not externally directed propaganda. The stories are published. You can kind of tell here it's not real great quality paper. There's, other than the illustration at the top of each story, there's no graphics whatsoever, it's not very jazzy to look at, but these are the sort of things that people will study in school. Maybe certain work groups will study them, and the Korean Writers Union itself disseminates these stories and reads them, but they are not transported out of the country legally. Some people smuggle them out of the country, and that's how I get them, but they're not intended for external consumption. So that's somewhat interesting. And again, I'm evaluating these as a political scientist. I'm not trained to evaluate their literary quality. As an amateur writer of fiction, sometimes I attempt to interpret what I think the writer's trying to do, but that's not my main objective. So in this talk today, I'm going to look at the Strong and Prosperous slogan, which, if you've read North Korean propaganda in recent years, I'm sure you're familiar with. You might be asking yourself, why talk about this now? This is sort of old news. The Strong and Prosperous slogan was promoted and started appearing in the early 2000s, but really started appearing a lot after about 2008, 2009. This slogan originally was meant to indicate that at a certain specific date, April 15th, 2012, the country would enter what they called the Strong and Prosperous era. And at that point, by that date, certain military goals would be achieved, certain infrastructure projects would be done. So the party implied that at this, up until this date, we're going to have to work really hard, we're going to have to bust our butts every single day. But when you get to this date, things are going to suddenly be better. We'll be a strong and prosperous nation, and we won't have to work so hard anymore. So a lot of foreign experts, myself included, kind of looked at this and said, these goals are impossible. They're never going to make this deadline that they've set for themselves. And it's kind of, especially after Kim Jong-il died right before the deadline and his son took over as a very young leader, a lot of people felt like this is going to be a disaster, that people are going to say, where's our strong and prosperous nation? I thought we were going to live the good life. And naturally in the West, we think of politics as if a politician kind of fails to live through a promise, they're going to be in trouble, or at the very least, they're going to stop repeating that promise. But as you can see, North Korean state fiction and other internal propaganda kept using this phrase after the deadline and talked about it as if it had been achieved. So it said, now we're living in the strong and prosperous era. And we have to ask ourselves, I think, how is this possible? How can they continue to talk about this phrase that was linked with prosperity and a good life when they didn't really achieve that? And as I look through the works of fiction, I found that it's been sort of reinterpreted. So you see, after 2012, it reoccurred in fiction stories, but it became much more connected with the new leader's priorities, and kind of moved away from the old idea of what strength and prosperity look like. So it can give you some ideas about how this new leader interprets the old slogan and reuses it for his own purposes. At the beginning here, I have to say a few words about leadership representation in North Korean literature, because this is very important. In North Korean literature, there's a hierarchy of writers. When you first get a story published, you're considered officially a part-time writer. If you get a certain number of stories published, then you become a full-time writer with a lot of privileges. You're free to travel the country, you're free to access information from outside, and once you get even more stories published, you can join the, it's called the 415 Writers Group. And this is the top tier, the highest hierarchy of writers in the Korean Writers Union. Among that group, only the very elite are allowed to write stories about members of the Kim family by name. So you think about, you have to climb this ladder. You have to produce stories that the party approves for many, many years. And when you get to that level, there are very strict rules about how the leaders are supposed to be portrayed, how they're physically supposed to be described, what their voices sound like. They're always described having a booming voice and a jolly voice. There are these kind of cookie cutter rules about how the leaders are to be described. In Kim Jong-il's case, he was always portrayed particularly as an artistic genius. He was, his work in film and art, that was obviously his priority, and so a lot of stories would show him kind of guiding artists and having inspiration about how that film should be produced, how art should be produced. That was Kim Jong-il's purview, so he was always described as an artistic genius. Kim Jong-un has been described as much more of a tech genius, or a tech whiz. So he, in the stories, he's often shown knowing all sorts of details. Like, he can look at an X-ray and he can tell you exactly what's going on in the X-ray. He can look at a computer program and tell you exactly where the problem is in the program, or how the nation's computer infrastructure needs to be upgraded. It's never clear where he gets this knowledge from, but he just knows more than the top scientists and the top researchers in the field. So that's his special thing. And as a consequence, the arts and the film have sort of gone by the wayside. Also, Kim Jong-il poured a lot of resources into film and theater, as I'm sure you know. Kim Jong-un, in turn, has promoted his interests, which appear to be kind of amusement facilities, leisure facilities, sports facilities, and luxury high-rises. So you see a lot more of these. There are commonalities between these two leaders that I think are worth mentioning when they're portrayed. First of all, they're always portrayed as being alone. They're surrounded by aides, of course, but they're never accompanied by a family member, a sister, or a wife. They're always either alone by themselves or with the father. So Kim Jong-il was portrayed accompanying his father, and then his father died and he was all alone, nobody helping him. And Kim Jong-un is portrayed the same way. So you'll see him in fiction and also in a lot of the pictures. I was really struck by how they promoted him meeting the South Korean president when he approaches Panmunjom, that dividing line. You see all of the people around him kind of peel off to the side, and he's all by himself. And it's this idea of the solitary figure with no support. I think they're trying to portray him as kind of lonely and fragile and just very, very brave, but all by himself. Like there's nobody around him of equal level. And the leader is also portrayed as very self-sacrificing. A lot of news stories will talk about Kim Jong-il now and how ill he was and how exhausted he was and how he tried to hide his illness from other people. And Kim Jong-un, in turn, feels great guilt in the stories that he didn't help his father more. And it's always repeated that his father died on a train on the way home from a guidance site, that he was just exhausted and he died of exhaustion. So the idea of the self-sacrificing leader continues. They're always portrayed as a little bit fragile, a little bit emotionally emotionally driven. Kim Jong-un in particular is shown mourning and missing his father and mother a lot. There's a scene in one story where he sees a sprig of azaleas and it reminds him of his mother, and so he sort of talks to this sprig of azaleas as if it is his mother. And then in another story, he keeps picking up the phone to call his father, but his father is dead. And so, he remembers and he's like, oh, I can't call my father. And he's really sad. And then he decides, well, maybe I'll just talk to him anyway. So he holds up this phone to his ear and he kind of says, Dad, I'm trying hard. I'm trying to make you proud. It's this really poignant scene that he's coming to terms with his father's death. So he's kind of fragile. He's a little bit emotionally scarred, and but he's also this super genius who knows everything. Both Kim and his father are portrayed as kind of going around the country and finding people just that are like diamonds in the rough, somebody who's a particularly talented artist or particularly gifted at math, and they'll find the person and they'll raise them up to be the top of their field. So Kim's role in the stories is to kind of wander the country and find all the best people. Finally, there's no better way to put this, but from a Western perspective, both the leader Kims are portrayed as kind of nosy. They always seem to know what's going on in the private lives of their underlings. So like a party assistant will be having trouble with their son who's doing poorly in school or something, and the leader will somehow find out about it and say, oh, you need to guide him to be a better father, or so. The leader always seems to know exactly how to solve these people's problems, and he seems to know a lot of personal details about the people around them, which as an American reader, I don't see that as a very good quality, but obviously to the Korean leaders, it shows that the leader is very compassionate, very observant of what's going on around him, and cares deeply about the people working for him. And they're also incredible mansplainers. So Kim Jong-un, there's one story where he's like touring this zoo, and he meets a woman who's been the main zookeeper for 50 plus years, and she's touring around the zoo with him, and he starts telling her like, oh, you need to be careful with those bears because they're dangerous animals, and she's like, oh, you know so much, and to my mind that's just insufferable, but the idea is that, yeah, he just knows everything and there's no questioning him, and everyone's so grateful to get his insights, even though it's their field and not his field. So moving into what are the elements of the strong and prosperous nation for Korea today, for North Koreans today. In the Kim Jong-un era, one of the most prominent things that I noticed is that stories are suddenly taking place a lot more in the capital, and they're referencing these kind of prestige projects, these facilities like the Rungna People's Pleasure Park, the amusement park that you might have seen Kim Jong-un was touring, And there's a big aquarium with a dolphin show that they seem to be very proud of. And the idea here seems to be to associate free leisure activities with the socialist system, as people should go to these places and go to these amusement parks, and that it's an example of something that in the West you would have to be kind of a big shot to do, but in North Korea, regular nobodies can go and enjoy the dolphin show. And this is not a quote from a short story, but this was an article on Uri Minjokkiri recently that was describing the scene at this dolphin show. It said, on Rungnado, the island like a flower barge floating on the river, one of the main attractions is the dolphinarium. Foreign visitors who witness the happy world and cultured lifestyle of our ordinary workers at the dolphinarium note approvingly that this is the sort of benefit that only socialism can provide. So it's not enough that North Koreans are happy. There's also this idea that foreigners are coming and are jealous that North Korea has a system where ordinary workers can go take in a dolphin show. Another story published just last year shows Kim Jong-un touring the Central Zoo. That's the one where he mansplains to the zookeeper. And he's talking about why this zoo project was so important to his father. He says, our general, that's Kim Jong-il, said that the Central Zoo is not just a treasure to be passed on to future generations, but a center of cultural and emotional life and learning for our youths and workers. In the story, Our Heavens, Kim Jong-un suggests that he's given this problem that the weather reports are always wrong. And he's trying to figure out why the Weather Bureau can't ever get it right. So he goes and he meets the workers and he concludes that they're lacking in a sense of teamwork, that their group ethic is not good. And so his suggestion for how to improve this is that the Weather Bureau workers should all be allotted mandatory fun excursions to these facilities in addition to their regular holidays, and that's going to build up their teamwork. There's another story where all of the veterans from the country visit Pyongyang, which is a big festival that's happening almost every year now since Kim Jong-un became the leader. There's this special 3-day festival where all the veterans in the country are bussed into the capital and get to go to Rungnado, and they get to see the dolphins, and they get to ride on the rides, and they get to eat at all the best restaurants. So this story goes through the list of like all the fun things that these old soldiers get to do in Pyongyang. And it seems like they're given a list, like, we just built this big facility for roller skating, so please mention the roller skating facility. In a big part of the Strong and Prosperous era, it seems like they're implying that Strong and Prosperous means a stylistic break from the bleak, kind of repetitive Stalinist atmosphere of the past, and a new focus on color and youthful creativity and vibrancy, and just a new aesthetic culture. So part of this is the new buildings in the capital, which are being promoted very heavily, and the new designs and the new, just overall new color scheme in the capital, which other experts have observed. People who've gone to Pyongyang have said that they've got a new color scheme now. It's all pastels. It's all like pinks and blues. And the stories will reflect this. They'll talk about how this new building is very childlike or very fanciful, or it's like a fairyland. They'll use this word a lot, fairyland. It's almost like they're trying to make the country into a sort of Disney World, like, looking nice from a child's perspective, having kind of the colors and the lights and music that a child would like. So, for instance, visiting this newly constructed children's hospital, Kim Jong-un remarks that even while studying military science, I feel ever more committed to peace and creating a brighter, more beautiful land. So he's saying, brighter and more beautiful is just as important as defending the country and the military. And when he visits the Weather Bureau, another piece of advice he gives them is that the weather report needs to be more friendly. They shouldn't just like report what the weather is. They should give some advice like don't forget your raincoat. They should kind of jazz it up a little bit, which puts me in the mind of somebody who has seen a lot of foreign media and then is looking at North Korean media and realizing how it's kind of stale in comparison. And then Kim Jong-un uses this phrase. He says, there's an old Korean expression, if it costs the same, why not get a red skirt? Which I've never heard this expression before, so maybe it's a North Korean unique expression. But the idea is, if it doesn't cost anything extra, we should make things a little prettier. We should try to make things a little cooler. It doesn't have to be just stark and socialist, which in the past was sort of condemned as, there's a word that North Koreans use called formalism, that anytime when form is prioritized over content, that's considered formalism. So they'll say, oh, the foreign news and TV, it's so flashy, it's so gaudy. The socialist way is better because we focus on the content. We don't try to distract people with meaningless color and light. But now they seem to be thinking that a little color is okay. So in another story, these officials are talking about the Moranbong band, which is, I think, pictured here. There was a concert early in Kim Jong-un's reign that a lot of senior officials were required to go to, of this Moranbong band. And it's kind of ladies in skimpy skirts, and they're a little bit more like a K-pop group. So earlier in the Kim Jong-un era, they tried to have this sort of almost competitor to K-pop. And in this one story, the senior officials are talking about what they saw at this concert. And one of them says, the Moranbong concert has made quite a stir. You could say that their main purpose was to sound a warning bell against habitual, rigid, backward ways of doing business. Their fresh, strong, and dynamic performance is what makes them so distinctive. It stirred everyone in the attendance to wake from their stupor and look around the world. It returned the elderly to the feeling of their youth and made them quicken their steps. As society advances with the times, the people's demand for new things grows. The Moranbong concert keenly reflected the spirit of the times, and it signaled a new model for creative and innovative thinking. So they're associating the idea of youth with innovation and with progress in a way that we haven't seen before, which, if you're prone to pop psychology, you might connect with the fact that the leader is very young and a lot of his new appointees are very young. So they're trying to promote the idea that having a young person in charge is not necessarily a bad thing. And finally, I need to mention these new luxury apartment high-rises that have gone up in the capital, appear in a lot of stories. Some foreign observers have pointed out that they look very impressive from the outside, but it appears that maybe they don't have indoor plumbing, or maybe their lights aren't working very well, and it sort of seems like people aren't living in them now. But when they were first built, they were a big difference for the Pyongyang skyline. And there's one story that talks about a family of teachers getting a new apartment in one of these high-rise complexes. And they're really surprised because they heard that the complexes are only for, the apartments are only for people in leading industries, and they're surprised that a teacher would get such a privilege. The mother says, "We really couldn't believe it. How could an ordinary family like ours get such good fortune? When we got the moving permit, we couldn't believe our eyes that such a home was really ours. And then the story goes on to describe all the features of the new building, and particularly the leisure facilities and the restaurants, and how the family gets an apartment on the 3rd floor, which is the ideal place you want to live because it means you don't have to climb that many stairs. So they're really grateful to Kim Jong-un for providing them with this new building. Looking at the way these buildings are promoted in recent fiction and recent propaganda materials, they seem to have been built mainly with the intention of making a more impressive skyline, and particularly trying to get them lit up at night so that Pyongyang looks a little bit like Kuala Lumpur or something. You know, like they have these nice, bright buildings. If you're into psychoanalysis, you could maybe say that Kim Jong-un's experience overseas as a child inspired him to want to spruce up his capital. I don't want to make too much of a deal out of the fact that Kim Jong-un lived for some time overseas, because I think that is sort of overemphasized in a lot of analysis. We really don't know how much he was immersed in the Western lifestyle. But we can at least say that Kim Jong-un is the first North Korean leader to have at least seen a modern Western metropolis. So his father and his grandfather, other than a few trips to China, they'd almost never been outside of the country. So they had this very rigid definition of economic growth means vamping up industrial production and making more, a little bit more light industry, and also having people live in nicer houses and having sufficient grain production. They didn't really think about making, a nice looking skyline and bright cities. That wasn't as much of a priority for them. So you could argue that Kim Jong-un's experience overseas has made him feel a little bit more embarrassed about his country's visual effect. And in line with this, there's a lot of emphasis now on bright lights and other bright things in stories. Light and heat are really emphasized as signs or associations with the better life in newer fiction. There's one story talks about these night illuminations on the border with China. There's a city called Changjiagang that apparently put up almost like a Christmas lights decoration so that it could be seen across the river. And Kim Jong-un is really praising this effort, saying Changjiagang is getting brighter and brighter. Those people, because they live in like the very far north of the country, those people know better than anyone just how precious a single point of light can be. So they labored to build the electric dams, singing patriotic songs to show their resolve to the enemies who crave our destruction, and now they have turned on the lights of paradise by their own hands. And in another story, Kim Jong-un personally designs this fireworks show for the military celebration of the end of the war. And this fireworks show happens every year, but Kim Jong-un took it over in 2011. And according to the story, he designed this new kind of firework that nobody had ever seen before. And he says, I decided to draw the people a picture in the sky with fire, a picture of the strong and prosperous nation for all our people and the world to see. So a strong and prosperous nation is associated with bright fireworks, bright buildings, and weirdly also associated with nuclear weapons. So there's this one line that really stood out to me in a story where Kim Jong-un is talking about his father and how he worked so hard, and he says that his father brightened the whole world with a self-defensive nuclear flash, which it sounds even weirder in Korean than it does in English, because there's this phrase like to brighten the world that you usually associate with like someone's smile or like being having a talent. And he's saying we brightened the world with a nuclear flash. it's really jarring to hear that and to think of, they're almost talking about these nuclear weapons as like a thing of beauty or like a decoration, as well as a self-defensive weapon. So that it's just interesting that they seem, clearly the party has heard foreigners talk about how dark the country is, and that they've seen the picture, the image that everyone's seen, where the North Korea is really dark and everything else is really bright. And it sounds like they're getting a little fed up with it. So they're at least trying to get some lights, even if they don't really work all the time and they're not really functional. But they're saying that the strong and prosperous era is an era when things are lit up and things are brighter. And I mentioned this a little earlier, but one of the other buzzwords of the Kim Jong-un era is the pinnacle of cutting-edge technology. So this is a word that's associated with Kim Jong-un and with the youth of the country, the idea seeming to be that younger people, their brains are more malleable and they're able to take on new ideas. So this has been observed by some South Korean scholars, that the country is really rewarding math and science and technology in ways that they didn't do before. So in the past, there were certain perks that would go to artists and people working in film. That was Kim Jong-il's priority. Now those same perks are being distributed more to people in science and technology research. Perks like if a scientist makes a big breakthrough in jet propulsion, he'll get maybe a parade in Pyongyang. And they're given luxury housing in the new apartment complexes. They get priority for housing. They also get military exemptions and some kind of flashy awards. Like there's one story that talks about Kim Jong-un deciding that scientists need a place to get away from the city to relax, to get inspired. So he builds them this giant resort on the beach in a place called Yeongpung-ho, which is a new beach resort, and I've seen pictures of it online. That's just for scientists to go and enjoy the beach and get away from their, so that they can find inspiration. So the stories are always talking about Kim Jong-un helping scientists, but when it gets into the details, it seems like his major method of helping them is by giving them kind of luxuries and hoping that the perks will help them to find inspiration. So you can speculate that this is the regime's effort to get more parents to push their children into the sciences as opposed to arts. And it's also associated with the 2012 education reform, which was Kim Jong-un's first major policy initiative. This added some courses to the standard curriculum. It extended the compulsory education from 11 years to 12. And there's one story that talks specifically about how Kim Jong-un developed this new curriculum. There's a striking moment where he's talking with his senior education minister, who's this really old guy, and he's kind of stuck in his ways. And Kim Jong-un admonishes him that middle school education is not meeting the demands of the knowledge economy era. This is another phrase that he repeats many times, the knowledge economy era. And he says that middle school education in particular is vital to cultivate useful personnel in science and technology. He particularly wants to emphasize math, physics, chemistry, and biology. And the story at several points repeats the same phrase. It says, scientific development must precede economic growth, and science develops through education. They're drawing a line. Better education, then you get the science, then you get the money. So you can draw whatever conclusions you want from that, but it's clear that the new regime is trying to put Kim Jong-un's face on being technologically literate and being younger and being more innovative. One thing you can't really avoid talking about with any Korean literature is the role of natural metaphors. These are an important element in Korean literature since the dawn of time. The nature metaphors are a very important part of the Confucian past, and they exist in South Korean literature as well. So when I look at the literature of the Kim Jong-un era, you see a lot of references to springtime. Kim Jong-un is associated with spring. His mother's favorite flower was the first flower to bloom in spring. A lot of stories have the word spring in their title now. Then you also see a lot of references to sunrise or dawn. And this phrase is strongly associated with the strong and prosperous nation phrase. So they'll say, we are now in the dawn of the strong and prosperous nation. That's another common phrase. And then you'll also see references to kind of green shoots or green buds, which seem to be associated with the youngest generation that grew up after the famine. And the idea that you have this parched, barren landscape of the famine, and then out of that grow these new green shoots that are going to take over the country and make everything better. So the takeaway that I get from all of these references to spring and regrowth, these metaphors were common in the period of post-war reconstruction after the Korean War. In fact, Kim Jong-il supposedly penned a famous poem called Springtime that North Korean children are required to memorize that was written right after the war and symbolizes regrowth after the war. So if the regime is bringing up springtime now in association with Kim Jong-un and the strong and prosperous era, you can say that maybe they're trying to bring back that sense of, we just had a really hard time and now we're rebuilding the country. So it's a period of regrowth. And speaking of nature, a lot of stories, a lot of the new story plots increasingly have what fiction writers would call man versus nature plots, so that the main enemy of a lot of these stories is natural disaster, which gives the sense that the environmental problems, and particularly the flooding and the deforestation, are seriously straining the regime, that they have to address this in their state fiction. There's a story that opens with a scene where a whole town is just wiped out by a flood, and then it talks about the flood relief efforts and Kim Jong-un going in and being like a general leading his troops. And there's a very martial language associated with this. So they're not just rebuilding homes that were damaged by floods. They are going to war against nature's tyranny. And the story repeatedly refers to the flood zone as the front line, and the people rebuilding as the troops being deployed to the front line or the point of battle. So it seems that even though there's not a war right now, and Kim Jong-un has never been in a war, he has this opportunity through the flood relief effort to be portrayed as like a general and a strategic thinker in a way that otherwise wouldn't be available to him. So they're really emphasizing this, that the new enemy is nature, the tyranny of nature. And there's another story where the country's top botanist is trying to develop a way to regrow the country's trees, which, as you know, the country has been horribly afflicted with deforestation since the famine. So this is a very important issue. And the botanist, he just can't figure out how to get these trees to grow fast enough. And Kim Jong-un takes him to his personal garden and shows him how he managed to grow this new hybrid form of tree, because Kim Jong-un, in addition to everything else, he has a incredible green thumb, and he starts quoting like obscure references to famous Russian botanists, and so the leading botanist in the country is like, wow, how does the leader know so much more than I do? And the story does a nice job of kind of highlighting the Central Tree Nursery, which is a project that's been going on for quite some time, but that Kim Jong-un has really promoted and done a lot of photo ops there. So there's this Central Tree Nursery in Pyongyang where they're trying to grow hybrid trees that will take to North Korean soil. So the frequency of these environmental stories suggests that this is a serious problem, a serious concern for the party, even though the stories are always just relentlessly optimistic. They're never, people are never suffering. People are always kind of, glad that the situation is finally improving. But it does address that there is a serious problem. I think I'm out of time, so I will just conclude that this new fiction suggests that the Strong and Prosperous era is about being a little bit more fun, being brighter, being more colorful, and that youth are going to lead the way, that young, fresh ideas are good, the old ways of doing things are maybe not bad, but not really working out, which is a significant departure from the old party line, which was that the old ways, the ways that were developed by Kim Il-sung, are the best possible thing, and that you can't really deviate from that. So Kim Jong-il, when he was the leader, he seemed to really understand that only so much change is tolerable. You can't really mess with the standard line too much. You can't really allow too much change, or it will sort of steamroll. And you can't let people get too excited about youth and trends and the future, because that can get out of control. It seems to me that Kim Jong-un and his cadres that he's brought in don't really have as much fear of promoting change and promoting new ideas, even foreign ideas, as something that is going to improve life. So I think that this is a very significant trend, and it will be worth watching if there's any kind of blowback from this new direction. So I will open it up to questions. Sure. Okay.
Thank you. That was a really great presentation. It was a great standalone presentation in addition to the paper, which really, both of them really complement each other very well. Before we open it up to the floor to open up the floor to questions, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions up here about the broader context of things. And first, just starting off with, at the beginning you mentioned that the literature isn't transported out of the country legally. Is there anything more that you know about the literature, how widely it's distributed maybe, or how important it is under Kim Jong-un? He's the tech whiz guy, so is he moving more towards dramas and TVs? We actually had a program on that last year with Jean Ling from the Wilson Center about that. So how does literature fit in, and what sort of some of the broader context of the things that you've been talking about in terms of the literature aspect of it?
Yes, I read Jean Lee's paper, and I found it very interesting. She suggests that the regime is moving away from movies towards TV, and that TV is getting a lot more production. And that kind of conflicts with something I read by a South Korean scholar who said that both movies and TV are dramatically reduced in recent years, but this was, in very recent years, and that the regime seems to have moved a lot of those resources into promoting athletics and promoting the national team sports, that this is Kim Jong-un's priority. I know that the production of the literary magazines, that's set. So there's a new Chosun Munak every month. It's the same length, the same number of stories every single month. So that's one of the reasons why it's so nice for computer-assisted content analysis, because you have the exact same number of words every year. So I can do something like the chart that said, that this phrase is increasing, but their print numbers are limited because it's expensive, and I have heard that Chosun Munok is only distributed within the Korean Writers Union, although I don't have confirmation on that, and that Cheongyeon Munok is distributed to schools, and that one is a little bit less elite, but more widely distributed. So that's something that I'm still trying to get to the bottom of, but they're not widely distributed in the sense that we would think of it. There are certain people in certain industries who are required to read these stories, it sounds like.
Interesting. And then, again, to widen the context, not just based on literature, but everything that's going on in the region and what's been going on to North Korea's situation, as you mentioned, from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, and there's really, really from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, what we see is a diminishing relative power to people, to the countries around them. So to what extent do you necessarily think that some of these stories are more reactive to some of that, the diminishing relative power? For example, you say we have to go. There's a story that says we have to go through. We have great things. Other people may have better things, but at least we made them ourselves. And then there's another example that you use in the paper. As long as you have faith in the party, almost anything can be forgiven. And to what extent, maybe is this like an allegory or a reference to the diminishing capability of the state to really control the markets and giving them more opportunity to go off and do your own thing, but just remember that at the end of the day, faith in the party is what matters.
Yeah. The story, the slide that I didn't get to was about the party being a little bit more, implying that there are some things that can be forgiven if you make a mistake done in service of the party, that maybe that's okay. I think you have to be careful that the things that they write in the stories don't actually reflect actual policies, perhaps. Like when they say that they're rebuilding the forests, they're maybe not going to actually achieve that, but it's what they want people to believe. So the fact that they want to encourage people to take more risks does suggest that that the party sees that as a potential route to the future. I associated it with more of the science and technology aspect and trying to encourage people to be more innovative thinkers, and maybe make some decisions on the ground. Like there's one story where this weather bureau official buys too much equipment, and he buys the expensive equipment when he was supposed to buy the cheap equipment, and so he overspends his budget. And the leader says, well, that's okay because you clearly care about doing a better job with weather prediction, and therefore I forgive you and I'm doubling your budget, which is really kind of surprising that they would say, even this guy went out and spent too much money and he got rewarded for it. I hadn't thought of it in terms of the regime not being capable of repression. And I don't think that they would want that message to get out, that's to say, well, we really can't enforce the law, so anything goes. I don't think that would be their intent, but it could reflect some subconscious acceptance that people are going to have to take more initiative on their own.
Okay, great. Thank you for those answers, and we'll turn things over now to everyone in the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand, state your name and affiliation before asking your question, and we'll take the first hand I see. Yes.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Paul Lee from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much. I think it's interesting that it seems to be there's a blurring of lines between fiction and nonfiction, especially if you're able to write fiction about Kim Jong-un or the Kim family. So what I'm really curious about is the reaction or responses among North Korean people. I know it's very difficult to get information about that, but based on maybe North Korean defector testimony or from South Korean analysts or from anything else that you've heard, do people these days in North Korea, is there a trend toward taking North Korean fiction or these stories about the North Korean leader more seriously, or do they also acknowledge that this is propaganda and this is clearly very exaggerated fiction?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I have talked with a few defectors in Seoul and actually shown them some of the stories that I'm reading, and said, "Did you read this stuff in North Korea, and what did you think of it?" Obviously, I haven't got access to recent defectors, so the people that I know were before Kim Jong-un's time, but the problem with this kind of questioning is, when I approach a North Korean and say, "Did you read the story and what did you think of it?" Their response is that they think I'm making fun of them because they've been out of the country a few years and they know that this stuff is ridiculous, and they want to be sure that I know that no, we didn't believe it. Even when we were in North Korea, we knew it was all crazy talk. So I feel like they feel the need to defend that they are thinking individuals and that they look at this stuff critically. So I wish I could talk with actual North Korean literary consumers living in the country and see just, how do you respond to this emotionally, not necessarily do you believe it or not. The sense I get is kind of like the old Paul Bunyan stories. It's like it's not real, but it kind of gives you a hero to look up to, and so you respond emotionally to that. And I'm sure even if they don't believe that Kim Jong-un is like a genius botanist who also can program computers and do all this stuff, even if they don't believe that, on some level I think they just think he's a really impressive person, and people like stories about superheroes. So in North Korea, you can't have a superhero that's more super than the leader. So he's like their Iron Man, and their like Paul Bunyan, and their Ant-Man, and all rolled into one. He's the superhero for them, and I think I imagine that there's some enjoyment of that, even if they don't really believe it's true.
Yes, please.
I'm KDO, Senior Asia Specialist at Institute for Defense Analysis. And I'm very glad to hear your presentation. It was really fun, nice work. And you mentioned about the why not red skirt. That expression is existing in Korean. 이왕이면 다음 치마. If you can choose red instead of black. It's very popular expressions. So I'm just telling you. But it's sort of like very curious after going through this literary survey, which really kind of like depicts the importance of the literature to continuously persuade people that you live in a great country and the leader is super and all these things. And I must admit that North Korea really achieved the 강성대국 in terms of nuclear power and missile power. And they are now even in negotiation not to give up, but how to keep up all these things while they are normalizing relationship with the world. And also it's a rich country, because so far in my recent survey that basically if you have a 10K, 120,000, 10,000, you are rich in olden days. In Pyongyang, if you don't have 100K, you are not Donju anymore. So the society really created an incredible rich class in Pyongyang. So my question is that the widening gap between the poor and rich, or the so-called very confident and hardworking chosen young generations favored by Kim Jong-un living in Pyongyang, and then the other people in the really countryside and remote side, and further down into the depression and desperation. And to these particular gaps and questions, what is the role of literature in a sense?
Yeah, I suppose that you could argue that you're correct that the the capital seems to be have some significant wealth now that it didn't have before, although there are disputes about how real that wealth is, and how much of it is just kind of the appearance of buildings that look nice. But the fact that fiction seems to be distributed mostly to the upper class, and particularly the leadership representation fiction seems to be something that's distributed to within the party and within the elite class. It could be that for those people, the strong and prosperous era has arrived, that they're doing better than they were before anyway. The nuclear and missile technology is at a stage now where you could say that they've achieved their goal, but not in 2012, not when the deadline happened. So there's a certain lag time which maybe people would forgive, as long as it's it's the strong and prosperous nation now, and if they don't see the poverty in the countryside, then maybe they can be convinced that it is indeed the strong and prosperous nation. But for the vast part of the country, things don't seem to be improving.
Hi, Phil Eskelin with KEI here. I was wondering if you detected in any of your readings in the literature about maybe trying to deal with rising expectations, because all these nice shiny stuff, maybe people would want more and more, and if the government can't deliver, then that might spark a little unrest in the country. Do you see anything in the literature like basically saying you should be satisfied with these things that come from Kim Jong-un?
Yeah, so as Kyle mentioned, the bottom line seems to be that our stuff might not be as great as foreign countries' stuff, but it was built with our own hands and with our own Juche spirit, and therefore we can be proud of it. Like all that stuff in South Korea, they just, the Americans bought it for them, and it's not really real. Fiction would never acknowledge any sign of dissent or unhappiness. One of the features of this fiction that I understand originated in socialist realism is that stories must be optimistic, that the heroine or the main character must always be optimistic and never kind of down on her luck. So there can be problems that are hard to solve, but things are always moving in a better direction and not in the reverse direction, and nobody's ever seriously doubting that the future is going to be better. So this is a feature of social realist literature that seems to be very much in play today. As I mentioned a little bit more in my paper, this idea that the regime, if they keep promising all these great things and then it doesn't happen, are people going to be unhappy? That's the central issue that I'm trying to solve here, is how can you continue publishing these stories where everything is always getting better, and that's not the objective reality. I think I was one of those who thought this strong and prosperous stuff was going to come back to bite them, and it doesn't seem like it has. There's no reports of serious unrest, even with people who have access to defectors inside the country. To North Koreans inside the country who are reporting on it. There's really nothing significant. So we as North Korean scholars have to find a way to explain that. Maybe they have a different concept of broken promises than we do, and the idea of the government delivering on its promises or else getting kicked out. Maybe that's something that they don't even consider. But it's a good question, and I'm still trying to solve it.
Hi, Young Kwan from KAI. Thank you so much for your presentation. In your presentation and also in your APS paper, you mentioned that literature also plays a role in kind of highlighting the external pressures that are on or against North Korea. So you mentioned nature. You also mentioned that sanctions do come up in hints and subtle themes and motifs. And I'm familiar with, in the 1950s and in the 60s, North Korean literature also made a huge emphasis in portraying South Korea in the most negative light. That was, their biggest external threat. And they used literature to portray South Korea as, lackeys to American generals and to capitalist interests. In, I guess, the most recent iteration of North Korean literature that you research in the Kim Jong-un era, where does South Korea come in? Is it mentioned at all? I mean, obviously, in terms of prosperity, I think the Pyongyang leadership probably recognizes that South Korea has surpassed them. So does it show up in literature? And if it does, how is it portrayed?
Yeah, South Korea shows up pretty rarely. There was one story that I read that talks about Kim Dae-jung's widow going to North Korea to pay her respects when Kim Jong-il died, and a lot of that story takes place in South Korea and shows, and she's a very sympathetic character, and she's surrounded by all of these South Korean politicians who don't want her to go, and she has to kind of fight the bureaucracy, and it was back in the era of still a pretty conservative government in South Korea. So the idea is that the central idea in that story was that a lot of South Koreans really wanted to pay their respects to Kim Jong-il, and the government just wouldn't let them, and it was really sad. So that story was dealt very extensively with South Korea. I haven't seen any other stories, and I'm just picking these stories out basically based on the title or the central. Some things that come up in the word search that make me think they'd be interesting. So I'm not necessarily avoiding South Korean stories, but I haven't seen that many, and I know from defector accounts by defectors who used to work in North Korean fiction that there's a hierarchy of story content. So the stories that are considered the best are the ones that take place during the anti-Japanese resistance period, and then there's the next down is the Korean War stories. The next down is current North Koreans' life, and then at the very bottom of the list is stories that take place in South Korea. And then one below that is stories that take place in a country other than Korea. So. So basically, if you're a writer and you want to write a story about somebody in South Korea, you're just not going to get as good of as many brownie points with the party as if you wrote about. So this writer that this guy Kim Ju-sung used to be a fiction writer in North Korea. He was a Zainichi Korean who went to North Korea and lived there for many, many years. And all of his stories were set in Japan, and he just could never break the barrier to become an established writer because he got terrible reviews, because they all said that his stories were ideologically inferior, even though he was talking about how terrible Japan is, but he just, So that might explain why there aren't that many stories talking about South Korea.
Hi, John Carl Baker from Plowshares Fund. I'm intrigued by the example that you gave earlier about how coverage of, I think it was the Dolphin Park, emphasized both the flash and pizzazz of the location, but also the fact that a variety of classes of people had access to it, that was something that distinguished it, in theory, from amusement parks elsewhere. And I'm wondering if you see evidence in this kind of emphasis on flash and spectacle in the literature you're looking at, of a redefinition of what counts, I guess, as socialism in North Korea. Because I could see how there's some tensions there, and it seems like there are some shifting, not not goalposts, I guess, but there is an aesthetic change, right, in the way that development is presented. And I'm wondering if that impacts what counts as socialism in the North at all.
Yeah, it seems like these amusement parks, for whatever reason they were built, they've become a fixture of the landscape and a fixture of the regime's propaganda, and so out of necessity they have to explain how this helps us to build a socialist society. And so as I mentioned, some of it is the idea that the scientists are going to get inspiration because they're having fun, and they shouldn't just sit in their office all day. And then the other idea is that in capitalist countries, supposedly, like, you have to be a really rich person to enjoy this stuff, and in socialist countries, you'll get your allotted day at the water park, and that will really impress the capitalist people who are suffering and struggling under the yoke of capitalism. That it shows how socialists can have fun too. So I think there is a message there that they really want to show that they have nice things as well. But I struggle to connect it with any kind of socialist ethic, because the attending these parks is a privilege that's granted by the party. So it's a different kind of privilege, I guess. But it is an interesting development.
Red shirt first.
Hi, thank you. I'm Varun Bhutani. I am a student at GW. The question I had was based upon what you spoke about before, about how the books were kind of targeting the higher class, obviously. Were they targeting anybody within the higher class, the younger generation, older generation, middle age, based upon like the wording or the stories themselves, kind of words they used?
I'm glad you asked that. Actually, there are different literary journals in North Korea for different age groups. So there's Chosun Munak is the elite for adults, and then Cheongyeon Munak, the name implies that it's youth literature, that it's for younger people, but it's not what you would call young adult. It's more like just slightly less ideological writing, a little bit more general audience writing. And then there's Adong Munak, which is the children's literature that I understand is taught in schools and in elementary school, so that's would be the lowest level. So those stories would maybe target a more fanciful audience. And those stories, sometimes they'll be like science fiction stories about going up in a spaceship or something. They'll be a little bit more whimsical and fun than the older stories. I don't believe that there's any marketing effort. So I don't. This is one thing that I would really love to ask if I could ever land an interview with someone from the Korean Writers Union, is do they analyze sales at all? Do they care about like which stories are big sellers, or is it just we're publishing these stories and they go out and they don't care if people want to read them or not? That's something that I haven't been able to get at.
My name is Norman Ventoy from the U.S. International Trade Commission. In terms of economic developments and international trade developments, I wonder whether have you heard anything about the North Korean government policy to follow certain models from other countries in terms of economic development and trade? Thank you.
So you're referring perhaps to China and the North Korea's regular tours of China and looking to follow the Chinese model. Certainly they would never say in a story, China's doing things well and we should follow their example. I've been trying to gather some evidence that the stories are implying a little bit more that foreign things are good. I found a few quotes in stories. I'm not ready yet to make a confident a conclusion that they're being more positive towards the outside world. But there are a few things, like when the Kim Jong-un goes to the Weather Bureau and he sees that their computers are really old, and he says, you know, with computers like these, we can't keep up with the forecasting models used by the most advanced countries, implying that, you know, that they're trying to keep up with the most advanced countries. So there's little quotes like that as a, you know, I try to be an objective reader, and I get to a line like that and I say, aha, they said foreign countries are better. And, you know, you can't jump on them that, you know, it's just really obscure. But they, you know, they'll say that, like, there's one line, I think I wrote it in the paper, where Kim Jong-un says that the weather report needs to be flashier, and he says he says it needs to be friendlier, and he says our socialist friendliness is fundamentally different from the friendliness of capitalism, which is only for the purpose of making money. So he said, you know, we should be a little bit friendlier and nicer, but it should be genuine and not in imitation of capitalist countries. So I've been trying to collect some evidence of that. I can't really conclude that that's the case so far.
So I don't see any more questions. So if anyone has any questions, we have about 5 more minutes left. You can come up here and talk with Meredith once we finish. You've answered a lot of questions, but it seems like there's a lot more questions left. So I'm really looking forward to reading more of your research on this. For those of you who don't know about her blog, what is it again? dprkblogspot.com is a really great resource, and for those of you who are interested in it, and for those of you who are just observers, I would encourage you also to take a look at it as well. It's also pretty interesting. So thank you again, Meredith, for your great presentation, and please join me, everyone, in thanking Meredith for her time.
Thank you.